Active transport. Passive transport moves material down its concentration gradient. It requires no energy input and stops once equilibrium is reached. However, some cells require concentration gradient to be created and maintained. Other cells must take in or expel materials too large to fit through the membrane protein. When passive transport will not get the job done, cells resort to active transport, which requires energy in the form of ATP. Ion and molecular pumps. A variety of active transport mechanisms move materials into and out of the cell. A common type of active transport uses membrane proteins called ion pumps and molecular pumps. These proteins use energy in the form of ATP to move substances in one direction or another, depending on the needs of the cell. For example, a nerve cell requires a very high concentration of sodium ions in the extracellular fluid and a similarly high concentration of potassium ions in the cytoplasm. The cell cannot achieve this state through passive transport. Once the concentration of an ion inside the cell equals that outside of the cell, equilibrium is reached and passive transport ceases. To create a concentration gradient, active transport is required. So in this picture, you can see a sodium-potassium pump moves ions against their concentration gradient with the energy from ATP. These sodium ions want to be in the cell, so you're going to use energy from ATP to make this protein force them out. They want to come in, use your energy to force them out. That's active transport. The potassium ions want to be out. You're going to use your energy to force them in. That's active transport. The sodium-potassium pump moves sodium and potassium ions across the cell membrane. Even if they are in equilibrium, or if the concentration gradient is in the opposite direction of transport. Say that again. The sodium-potassium pump moves sodium and potassium ions across the cell membrane. Even if they are in equilibrium, the sodium-potassium pump moves sodium-potassium ions across the sodium-potassium pump moves sodium and potassium ions across the cell membrane, even if they're in equilibrium, or if the concentration gradient is in the opposite direction of transport. Moving ions against the concentration gradient requires energy. ATP powers the pump, allowing it to create and maintain concentration gradients of these ions. Cells of the small intestine must absorb glucose from digested food. Two types of membrane proteins work together to help glucose cross these cells. Glucose-sodium co-transport proteins facilitate the absorption of glucose. They allow sodium ions to enter the cell. Each pair of sodium ions that enter take a glucose molecule along with them. Sodium-potassium pumps move sodium ions from inside the cell into the small intestine. Which statement compares the sodium-potassium pump to the glucose-sodium co-transporter? We're going to jump right down to the correct answer. C, the glucose-sodium co-transporter relies on the concentration gradient, while the sodium-glucose pump requires ATP. That is a comparison. So glucose-sodium co-transporter is passive transport. This sodium-glucose pump is active transport. Endocytosis and exocytosis. Macromolecules are often too large to fit through the cell membrane or membrane proteins. Cells can transport these molecules by packaging them in vesicles. Recall that a vesicle is a membrane sac found in the cytoplasm. Vesicles carry materials between different parts of the cell. Vesicles also transport materials in and out of the cell. In exocytosis, a vesicle moves toward the plasma membrane and fuses with it. The phospholipid bilayer, shows right here, by the way, down here. Vesicle fuses with the membrane and then opens up. The phospholipid bilayer that makes up the vesicle joins the plasma membrane, and the material in the vesicle is released into the extracellular space. In endocytosis, the reverse occurs. So this is exocytosis, making the material exit the cell. This is endocytosis, making the material enter the cell. In endocytosis, the reverse occurs. The plasma membrane pinches inward around the material located outside the cell. It swallows the material, swallows in quotation marks. It swallows the materials, forming a vesicle around it that separates from the plasma. It swallows the material, forming a vesicle around it that separates from the plasma membrane and travels into the cytoplasm. Both endocytosis and exocytosis require energy in the form of ATP. They are forms of active transport. A vesicle forms from the Golgi apparatus. The vesicle membrane holds a protein on the surface that faces the cytoplasm. When the vesicle fuses to the plasma membrane, will the protein face the cytoplasm or the extracellular fluid? The protein will face the cytoplasm. This example describes exocytosis, when the vesicle fuses with the membrane, as shown in the image of exocytosis, right here. Its inner surface becomes the outer surface of the cell. The proteins on the outer surface of the vesicle will be located on the inner surface of the plasma membrane facing the cytoplasm of the cell. So this is the outer surface, this is the inner surface of the vesicle. The outer surface of the vesicle, and this is the inner surface of the cell, this is the outer surface of the cell. You see that the outer surface of the vesicle attaches to the inner surface of the membrane. So the outer surface of the vesicle becomes the inner surface of the membrane. Now I'm going to read the questions. And these are the same questions that will appear on a Google form on Google Classroom waiting for you. Please read each question carefully. For multiple choice questions, circle the letter of the correct response. For a constructed response question, write your answers on the lines. What is the major difference between active and passive transport? A, active transport moves ions while passive transport does not. B, active transport requires energy while passive transport does not. C, active transport involves a concentration gradient while passive transport does not. Or D, active transport uses membrane proteins while passive transport does not. Use this diagram to answer question 2. So take a look at the diagram. There is a protein. Hydrogen ions are being forced out using energy from ATP. This is a protein pump using energy to force hydrogen ions out. Over here, there is no ATP involved. They just happen to come right back in. Just be forced out again, and then they come back in. Here, sucrose, sugar, also comes back in. The diagram shows how a plant cell transports sucrose, a sugar. The plant cell wall is not shown. The protein pump, left, transports hydrogen ions outside of the cell. The transport protein, right, allows hydrogen ions to move into the cell, but it must move a sucrose molecule along with each ion. Which statement best describes the transport of sucrose across the plasma membrane of the plant cell? Shrink it a bit so you can see the picture. A, active transport of sucrose provides the energy to transport hydrogen ions. B, facilitated transport of sucrose provides the energy to transport hydrogen ions. C, active transport of hydrogen ions creates a concentration gradient of sucrose. Or D, facilitated transport of hydrogen ions creates a concentration gradient of sucrose. 3, cholesterol does not dissolve in blood and other water-based bodily fluids. To be transported throughout the body, it must be encased in lipoproteins, macromolecules that are water-soluble. How can a cell take in lipoproteins from the extracellular fluid? A is exocytosis, B is endocytosis, 3 is a molecular pump, or D is facilitated diffusion. I will point out that it says this is a macromolecule, a large molecule. Use the diagram below to answer question 4. So we have a phospholipid bilayer, the plasma membrane, a protein, and potassium moving in the upward direction from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. The diagram shows the movement of a substance across a plasma membrane. What is true about this process? It requires no energy. It is called exocytosis. It creates a concentration gradient. It stops when equilibrium is reached. And constructed response. Number 5, materials in cells may be transported by passive or active processes, both of which may involve concentration gradients, the phospholipid bilayer and membrane proteins. A, compare the role of concentration gradients in passive and active transport. B, compare the roles of phospholipid bilayer in passive and active transport. And C, compare the roles of the membrane proteins in passive and active transport. That is it. Have a nice day.